The advertisement had run 3 weeks in the Perth paper before she answered it, and even then she did not answer it the way the others must have. She did not write of her cooking or her piety or the children she hoped to keep. She wrote that she could read a millstone and balance a ledger, and that she was not afraid of cold water or a long winter. And she signed it with her initials and the name of the rooming house where she could be reached. The reply, when it came, was 4 lines long. He needed a wife who could bake and keep a house and was not put off by hard work. He had a grist mill on the Mink River, 2 miles below the village of Carlow, room and board until things were settled, and if it suited them both, they would speak to the minister before the river froze. He did not say anything kind, and she noticed that. And she noticed too that he had not lied to make himself sound like more than he was. Most men did. She had buried one who lied beautifully. She came up from Perth on the back of a hay wagon the 2nd week of October. With the maples going to rust along the concession road and the sky the flat gray of dishwater. She had a canvas grip and a wooden box of her father's tools that she would not let the wagoner lift for her. And she carried the box on her own knees the whole way so that it would not jostle. The village of Carlow was a church, a store, a smithy, and a scatter of frame houses going silver in the weather. The woman behind the counter at the store watched her through the glass the way people watched in places like this, openly while pretending not to. And when she went in to ask the road to the mill, the storekeeper, a wide, kindly-faced woman who said her name was Mrs. Quayle as though it were a small confession, told her the way, and then told her, unasked, that the mill had been going downhill for 2 years, and that the man who ran it kept to himself, and that she should not expect much. She thanked her for the directions and said nothing about the rest. The mill stood at a bend where the river dropped over a low fall, and she heard it before she saw it, though what she heard was wrong. A mill on the water ought to have a rhythm to it, a deep, patient turning, and this one had a slap and a stutter, a wheel laboring at something it could not quite get hold of. She stood on the side road above it for a while, with the box of tools cutting into her arms, and listened. The dam was earth and timber, and it was leaking in 2 places that she could see from where she stood. Dark fans of water bleeding through the face of it into the tail race below. The pond behind it sat low. Somebody had let the level fall, which meant somebody had given up on holding it. He was at the foot of the head race when she came down, sleeves rolled, both arms wet to the shoulder, working a jammed sluice gate with a peavey, and he did not hear her over the noise of the fall. She set her grip down and waited. He was a tall man gone lean in the way men go lean when they have been doing too much alone for too long. Dark hair shot gray at the temples, though she did not think he was past 40, and there was a stillness in him even while he worked, a way of pausing between efforts to study the thing he was fighting, rather than simply fighting it harder. She approved of that before she had decided to approve of anything about him. When he finally felt her there and turned, his face did not change much. He looked at her, and then he looked at the box on the ground beside her grip, and something flickered behind his eyes, a question he did not ask. "You're the one who wrote about the millstone," he said. "I am." He wiped his hands down his trousers. "I thought that was a manner of speaking." "It wasn't," she said. He looked at her a moment longer. Then he said the supper would be cold mutton and bread if she wanted it, and that the back room was hers, and that they could talk to the minister or not, as she decided once she had seen what she was getting into. She thought that was a fair way to put it. He had not tried to make the mill sound like anything other than what she had already heard it to be from the road. The bread that night was the first thing that told her the rest. She ate it because she was hungry, and because refusing food was a thing she had taught herself never to do. But she turned it over in her fingers under the table where he could not see, and she did not like what she felt. It was heavy and close-grained, and there was grit in it, fine grit, the kind that did not come from a careless cook, but from somewhere further back. An old man she had not met yet had baked it, the hired man, the man called Amos Telfer, who came in late from the barn with river mud to his knees and ate without much talk and watched her, with frank, watery eyes the whole meal, and then said, apropos of nothing, that it was good to have a woman in the house again. She thanked him. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that the grit in his bread had been ground into the flour itself, that no amount of sifting would have taken it out. that the stones upstairs were eating themselves. She slept badly the first night, the way she always did in a new place, and she lay listening to the wheel slap and stutter in the dark and thought about her father, who had built mills and rebuilt them up and down the country above Kingston, and who had let her stand at his elbow from the time she was small enough to need a stool. Because he had no son and because, he said once, she had the only steady hands in the family. He had taught her to dress a stone, to chip the furrows true with the bill, so the meal walked outward clean and cool instead of cooking on hot, dull faces. He had been dead 9 years, her husband 6, her daughter 5 in the winter after, of the same fever. She had grown precise about what she needed in the years since and quiet about what she felt. And she had not expected a 4-line letter to be the thing that finally moved her. There was something in its plainness she had not finished deciding about. In the morning, she asked to see the stones before she would say anything else. He took her up the ladder into the mill loft without comment, and she liked that too, that he did not ask her why or warn her it was no place for her. The runner's stone was turning when they came up, the whole frame trembling with it, and she put her bare hand flat on the bench beside the vat and felt the trouble of it come up through the wood into her palm. It was running hot. She could smell it, that faint scorched flour smell that meant the faces were riding too close and too dull. She had him stop the works, and when the stone had wound down and lay still, she had him lift the runner with the crane so she could see the grinding face. And what she saw there she had expected from the bread. The furrows were worn shallow as old footpaths. The lands between them were glazed and polished where they should have been sharp. The stone had not been dressed in years, and a stone that is not dressed does not grind. It crushes, and crushing heats the meal, and beats the river silt into the flour, and gives an old man's bread its grit. How long, she said, since anyone freshened these? He stood looking at the stone in the way a man looks at a thing he has been not looking at for a long time. My father did it, he said. I helped him. I never did it on my own. Amos doesn't have the hands for it anymore. She nodded. She did not say anything about his hands, which she had already seen were good hands. She crouched and ran her thumb along a furrow and felt how far gone it was, and she thought, this is a week of work, maybe 2, and it is the smallest of the things wrong here. But it was a beginning, and it was a beginning she knew the whole of, which was more than she could say yet for the dam, or the leaking flume, or the pond he had let go low because he had stopped believing the dam would hold what he gave it. I'd like to see the dam today, she said, and the race, all of it. He looked at her for a moment the way he had looked at the box of tools. Then he said he would saddle the horses, and he went down the ladder, and she stayed a moment longer with her hand on the cold stone, listening to the water go on falling outside without anyone making any use of it at all. They walked the works that day, rather than rode, because the things she needed to see were close. He brought Amos along part of the way, and the old man talked more freely out of doors. And from him she got the history the man himself would not have given her in a month. The mill had been the busiest on the Mink. In the father's time, she learned. 3 days a week the road above had been lined with wagons, grain coming down from as far as Carlow and the Renaud farms beyond it, and people came to this mill and not the one at the falls 8 miles north, because this stone ran cool and this flour baked white. Then the father had died. Then there had been a wet autumn that washed the face of the dam, and the man had patched it instead of rebuilding it. Because rebuilding it meant draining the pond, and standing idle a season, he could not afford to stand idle. And the patch had held but only just, and so he had run the pond low to spare the dam, and a low pond turned the wheel slow, and a slow wheel ground coarse and coarse flour. Lost him the trade that had been his father's, 1 wagon at a time, until the Renauds went to the falls. And the Carlow road came down to home only when the falls was froze or flooded, and they had nowhere better. 2 years of that. A man could lose a great deal in 2 years by doing nothing but the careful, reasonable, frightened thing. She stood at the face of the dam where the 2 dark fans of water bled through, and she crouched and pushed her fingers into the wet earth of it, and it gave under her hand like bread dough, soft all the way in, no heart of it left. It won't take another freshet, she said. No, he said. He did not argue. He said it the way a man says a thing he has known and not said for a long time. And there was something almost like relief in his voice at hearing it said out loud by someone else, as though the saying of it lifted a small part of the weight off him. You can't patch it again. No, you'd have to draw the pond right down and lay it new. Timber crib, clay core, riprap on the face. She stood and wiped her hand on her skirt. Before freeze up, the clay won't set once the frost's in it. He looked at the dam, and then he looked at the low gray sky, and she watched him do the sum she had already done. The sum that came out to a fortnight of brutal work in cold water with the season closing on them and no margin at all if it went wrong. That's not a thing two people do, he said. No, she agreed. It's a thing two people and their neighbors do. He was quiet a while. Then he said the neighbors were at the falls now. They didn't grind here anymore. There wasn't a reason in the world they'd come stand in the river in October for a mill they'd already given up on. She thought about that. There's a reason, she said. They'd come for the man as your father was, if you went and asked them as your father's son. People remember a cool stone. They remember whose flour baked their wedding bread. You just have to be willing to go and stand on a man's step and say you got it wrong and you mean to make it right. She paused. That's harder than the dam. I know it is. But the dam won't get built without it. He did not answer for a long time. The water went on, bleeding through the face of the dam beside them, patient and indifferent. The way water is when it has all the time in the world and you have none. He went to the Renault farm the next morning. He did not tell her he was going. She only saw him take the horse up the side road with his hat in his hand instead of on his head, which she understood, and she stayed and worked on the stones while he was gone, because a thing that can be done alone should be done while the things that can't are being arranged. She had Amos rig the crane and turn the runner up on edge, and she set the bench stone where the light from the loft window fell across it. And she took the bill out of her father's box and began. And it was the first time she had dressed a stone in 9 years, and her hands remembered it before her mind did. The bill rang on the quartz. The grit fell. She worked the furrows back to true, deepening them, sharpening the lands, the old patient crosshatch coming back up out of the worn stone like a thing she was waking rather than making. Amos sat on an upturned firkin and watched her with his watery eyes, and after a long while he said she dressed a stone the way a man did, and then he heard himself and looked stricken, and she laughed. She was surprised by her own laugh. She had not laughed in some time, and told him her father had taught her and that her father had said the same thing and had meant it kindly, and she decided to take it kindly, and that Amos might as well too. The old man's face eased. They got on after that. The man came back near dark. She did not ask how it had gone. She read it in his shoulders, which were not bowed, and she went on with the supper. It was only when they were nearly through eating, the three of them, that he said, to the table generally rather than to her, that the Renauds would come Saturday, and the Doyles and old Brennan and his 2 boys, and that Mrs. Quayle had heard him out in the store and said she'd send her husband and a barrel of pork to feed whoever turned up. He said it plainly, but his ears had gone red, and she understood what it had cost a man like him to go down those steps one after another and stand in those doorways and say he had got it wrong. She did not make anything of it. She passed him the bread. Her bread, the first batch off the dress practice stone, white and light and grit-free, and she watched him notice it without saying anything, watched him eat a second piece of it slowly, and that was enough. They drew the pond down over 3 days, and on the Saturday the neighbors came. She had not expected so many. They came in wagons down the cider road in the early dark with lanterns and crowbars and clay spades, and their wives behind them with covered baskets, and they stood about in the cold with their breath smoking and looked at the drained pond and the gaunt cribwork of the old dam standing naked in the mud, and for a moment nobody moved. Because it is one thing to say you'll come and another to look at 2 weeks of killing work in freezing water and begin. Then old Brennan, who must have been 70 and had a face like a split walnut, spat into the mud and said his own father had been married out of bread ground at this mill, and he'd be damned if he'd let it fall in while he had breath, and he took up a spade, and after that they all moved. The days that followed were the hardest she could remember, and she had had some hard ones. They worked in the riverbed in water that went from cold to a kind of cold that stopped feeling like cold and started feeling like fire. The men driving new piling and laying the timber crib, the women and the older children passing clay in barrows to be puddled and trodden into the core, the whole of it racing the frost that crept a little further into the ground every night. She worked as hard as any of them and harder than most. And somewhere in the second week, she understood that they had stopped watching her as the strange woman the miller had sent away for, and started simply working beside her, handing her the spade, taking the barrow off the way you do with someone you have decided, without discussing it, to count as one of your own. He worked at the center of all of it, and she watched him change a little day by day, watched the stillness in him open into something that could give an order and take a joke, watched the neighbor's easiness with him remind him of a version of himself he had let the 2 bad years bury. On the coldest night, when a section of the green clay core slumped at dusk, and it seemed for an hour that they had lost the whole face, and the river would be back through it before they could close it again, she saw him stand in the breach, in the dark up to his thighs in the water, and not despair. And she went in beside him without being asked, and the 2 of them held a timber square against the current with their shoulders, while the Reno boys drove the piles to pin it, and it held. She remembered afterward that he had put one hand briefly on her shoulder in the dark when it held. Not a word, just the weight of his hand for a moment, there and gone, and that she had let it stay. They closed the dam 2 days before the hard freeze came down out of the north and locked the country white. They had not finished the riprap on the face, but the core was set and the crib was sound, and when the man walked the gate open and the pond began, slowly, over a day and a night, to fill behind the new dam, the whole valley came to watch the water rise against work that would hold. It rose to the old high mark and held there, dark and deep and patient, and the leak that had bled through the face for 2 years did not come, and a kind of silence went through the people standing on the bank that was better than any cheer. He stood looking at the full pond a long time. Then he came and found her where she stood a little apart, and he did not say anything large. He said the stones were dressed, and the pond was full, and that he supposed they had better grind something before the whole county's grain spoiled in the cribs. But his voice was not quite steady when he said it, and she understood that this was the most that a man like him could say, and that it was a great deal. They ground the first clean flour the week before Christmas, with the pond high and the wheel turning deep and true at last. No slap, no stutter, the whole mill humming with the low, patient rhythm she had been listening for since the road. The flour came off her throwstones cool and white and fine. She baked it into bread that rose high and broke open soft and had no grit in it anywhere. And she sent the first loaf up the cider road to the Renauds with one of the Brennan boys, because she had learned by then how a place like this remembered things and how a loaf could say a thing that a man's pride would never let him say aloud. The Carlow road filled up again that winter, 1 wagon and then 2, and then the line of them she had been told about, grain coming down off the snow-deep concessions to the mill that ran cool again. And the man stood in the doorway of his own mill in the white light off the snow and watched the wagons come, and she watched him from the office window where she kept the books, and neither of them said anything, because some things did not need it. There was an evening in February, deep in the cold, when she was at the desk in the office, with the ledger open and the lamp lit, working the long columns of the season into order, whose grain, how many bushels, what owing, what paid in kind and what in coin. And he came in, stamping the snow off, and stood a moment, and then he set something on the corner of the desk without a word, and went to warm his hands at the stove. She looked at it. It was a bread peel, a baker's paddle, the long wooden kind for drawing loaves from a deep oven. And he had made it. She could see that he had made it. The handle was smooth to the grain, the blade thinned and trued, and along the edge where a maker's mark would go he had cut, small and plain, the year. He had carved it in the evenings, she realized, in the same unhurried way he did everything, while she had thought he was only mending harness. It was not a flower. No one in their right mind would have called it a romantic thing. It was a tool for the work she did, made true by a man who could not say what he meant in any language, but the language of things made true. She looked at it for a while. She did not pick it up just then, and she did not thank him, because thanking him would have made it smaller. She left it where it was and went on with her figures, And after a while he came and stood behind her and looked over her shoulder at the long, honest columns of the ledger, the mill paying its way for the first time in years. And he said quietly that her father must have been a good man. She said he was. That was all. But she carried the peel up to the kitchen that night, and she used it the next morning and every morning after, and it was the only baker's peel she would use for the rest of her life. They spoke to the minister in the spring, when the river broke up and went out in a grinding rush of gray ice, and the pond ran high with the freshet, and the new dam stood through it without so much as a tremor, which was, she thought, the only wedding present she had ever truly wanted. Thing she had built with her own hands, holding against everything the river could throw at it. They did not make much of the day. It was not in either of them to. But Mrs. Quayle cried in the church for no reason she could give, and old Brennan kissed the bride's hand like a courtier and ruined it by spitting afterward out the church door. And the Renault women had baked, all of them, with the mill's own flour, so that the whole long table was loaves, and there was not a grain of grit in any of it. Amos Telfer stayed through the rebuild and the first full year, and when his hands and his knees had finally given out past the point where pride could carry them, it was she who saw it first, the way he had begun to do less and hide that he was doing less. And it was she who sat with him one evening on the mill steps in the long northern dusk and asked him, plainly, the way they all spoke to each other now, where he would rather be when the next winter came. He had a daughter married down at the falls, it turned out, with a house full of grandchildren and a warm kitchen and a standing wish to have her father near. He had not gone because he could not leave the mill while the mill was failing. He had not been able to walk out on a sinking thing. She told him the thing was not sinking anymore. She told him he had held it up with his own two ruined hands through the years when no one else would, and that there was no shame on God's earth in setting a thing down once it was steady enough to stand without you. He went down to his daughters that autumn. They drove him to the falls themselves, the man and the woman, with his box on the wagon between them, and the parting was not the kind that vanishes from a story like a stone dropped in a pond. They went and saw him at Christmas and at Easter, and he came up the river one last summer to sit in the sun by the mill he had saved and watch the wheel turn deep and true. And when he died, it was in his daughter's warm kitchen with people who loved him in the room, which is more than most men get, and they were both at the burying, and the woman set a loaf of the mill's bread on the grave because she had learned, in that country, what a loaf could say. The mill became the busiest on the Mink, as busy as it had been in the father's day, and then busier, because she had ideas the father had never had. A second run of stones for the buckwheat the French farms grew, an oat roller she had read about, and badgered a foundry in Perth into casting to her own drawing, a smaller bolting cloth that took the flour finer. She kept the books and dressed the stones and grew, over the years, a reputation up and down the valley of her own. The miller's wife who could tell you what was wrong with your churn, or your harness, or your bad baking flour by the feel of it, and who had been seen, more than once, up to her shoulders in a neighbor's stalled mill race showing the men what they had done wrong. He ran the dam and the trade and the long hauls and the men, and the line between what was his work and what was hers blurred so often that after a while neither of them thought of the two as separate things at all. There was a notice in the county almanac, the third year, listing the mills of the district and their grind. And the mill on the Mink was named the first of them, and the almanac got the figures right and spelled the river wrong, the way printed things do. And she crossed out the error in pencil in the margin and corrected it in her own small hand and set the page in the front of the ledger between the years. He found it there one evening, reading by the lamp, and he did not say anything about it. But the next spring, there was a new sign over the mill door, painted by his own slow, careful hand, with the name of the river spelled the way she had corrected it, hung where the first light off the river would catch it of a morning, and there was a window. He cut it himself the second summer, into the east wall of the office where she kept the books, where before there had been only a blind plank wall, so that the morning light came across her desk and across the long, honest columns of the ledger, and so that she could lift her head from the figures and see the river and the wheel and the deep, full pond she had built. She had not asked for it. She came down one morning, and it was simply there, the new sash, the light pouring through, the river bright beyond it. He had set a chair by it without saying anything, and over time, in the evenings when the day's grinding was done, it became the place they sat, the two of them, in the last of the light, with the wheel ticking over slow, and the water going on falling the way it had been falling when she first stood up on the side-road and listened and knew that something here was wrong and could be made right. She sat there one evening late in their first full year of plenty, with the ledger closed and the lamp not yet lit, and she watched the light go gold and then gray across the water she had learned to hold. And she thought, the way she rarely let herself think about the years she had spent becoming so precise about what she needed and so quiet about what she felt. She had answered a 4-line letter that promised her nothing but room and board and hard work and the honest cold of a northern winter. She had got all of that, and she had got more than that. And the more had come not in any single moment she could point to, but slowly, the way the pond fills behind a sound dam, a day and a night at a time, until one morning you look, and the water stands high against work that holds, and you understand that the thing you stopped letting yourself hope for has been quietly rising behind you all along. He came in from the mill and washed his hands at the basin, and came and sat in the other chair, and neither of them spoke, and the river went on falling, and the light went out of the water gone by gone, and they stayed until it was dark.